On the morning of March the 23rd, 1972, Walter Jennings stood outside a modest brick townhouse on 34th Street in Washington, District of Columbia, adjusting his weathered leather tool bag. The spring air carried the scent of cherry blossoms from the nearby tidal basin, and the city hummed with its usual rhythm of government workers and diplomats moving through their routines. Walter, a 53-year-old locksmith with calloused hands and reading glasses perpetually sliding down his nose, had no reason to suspect this would be anything other than a routine service call. The work order simply stated that the tenant, a Mr. Victor Petrov, needed help with a stubborn deadbolt that refused to turn. Walter believed this would take 20 minutes, perhaps 30 at most. He had no idea he was about to stumble into one of the most carefully guarded Soviet intelligence operations on American soil. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Walter had been working as a locksmith in Washington for nearly 3 decades. His father had taught him the trade back in the 1940s, when Walter was just a teenager, helping out in the family shop after school. Old Herman Jennings had been a locksmith since before the Great Depression, and he had passed down not just technical knowledge, but a philosophy about the work. Locks are about trust, Herman would say, filing down a key with practiced precision. People trust you with access to their homes, their businesses, their secrets. You honor that trust by being honest and doing the work right. Walter had taken those lessons to heart. After serving 2 years in the Army, stationed at Fort Meade, where he had worked in supply management, he had returned to Washington and joined his father's business. When Herman retired in 1957, Walter took over the shop on Pennsylvania Avenue, keeping the name Jennings & Son, even though he was now the only Jennings working there. He had considered bringing in his own son eventually, but Thomas had shown more interest in engineering than locksmithing, and Walter had supported that choice. Not everyone needed to follow in their father's footsteps. Over the years, Walter had developed a reputation for excellence. He took pride in his craft, in the way a key's teeth must align perfectly with a lock's pins, in the satisfying click when everything fell into place. He understood the mechanical elegance of a well-designed lock, how physics and geometry combine to create security. He could pick most locks if necessary, though he rarely did so except when helping people who had locked themselves out of their own property. He had installed security systems in congressional offices, replaced locks at the Smithsonian, and even once did emergency work at the White House when a door lock failed during a state dinner. He'd worked on everything from simple residential locks to complex commercial security systems. His reputation for discretion and reliability had earned him clients throughout the city, including several embassies and government buildings. Embassy work was particularly interesting because different countries had different approaches to security. The British preferred traditional mechanical locks with complex pin systems. The Germans favored precision engineering with minimal tolerance for error. The French often incorporated decorative elements even in functional hardware. Walter had learned to appreciate these cultural differences in his craft, but nothing in his experience, not the embassy work or the government contracts or the decades of study, had prepared him for what waited behind that ordinary-looking door on 34th Street. He knocked twice, then waited. The door opened just wide enough for a man's face to appear in the gap. Victor Petrov was in his early 40s, with dark hair combed neatly back and eyes that seemed to evaluate Walter in a single glance. His accent was thick, but his English was clear. "Good morning," said Victor, opening the door wider. "You are the locksmith, yes, Mr. Jennings?" "That's right," Walter replied, showing his identification badge. "You called about a problem with your deadbolt?" Yes, come in, please," Victor said, stepping aside. The interior of the townhouse was surprisingly sparse. The living room contained only a sofa upholstered in dark brown fabric that looked new and barely used, a coffee table with a glass top that reflected the ceiling light, and a bookshelf with a handful of volumes arranged with mathematical precision. Walter noticed the titles as he passed: Histories of American Architecture, a collected works of Mark Twain, volumes about the Civil War. The kind of books someone might buy to appear educated and American, but not the kind of collection that showed real passion or personality. no photographs on the walls, no personal touches that might reveal anything about the occupant. The whole space felt staged, like a furniture showroom rather than a home where someone actually lived. Walter noticed this in the way a tradesman notices things, filing it away without particular concern. Some people lived simply. That was their business. He had seen all kinds of living situations in his career. Hoarders whose homes were mazes of collected junk. Minimalists who owned almost nothing. Wealthy clients with artwork worth more than Walter's house. Poor families making do with second-hand furniture and hope. He didn't judge. He just fixed locks and moved on to the next job. But there was something about the careful emptiness of this townhouse that nagged at him, even if he couldn't articulate why. "It is the back door," Victor explained, leading Walter through a narrow hallway past a small kitchen. "The lock, it does not turn smoothly. Sometimes it sticks completely. I am worried it will break." The back door opened onto a small enclosed courtyard, barely 10 feet square, surrounded by high brick walls that blocked any view from neighboring properties. A few weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete paving, and an old metal trash can sat in one corner. It was private, isolated, perfect for entering or leaving without being observed. Walter filed that observation away too, another small detail that meant nothing by itself. Walter knelt down to examine the lock, his knees creaking slightly as they always did these days. It was a standard residential deadbolt, a Schlager model that was common enough in this neighborhood. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. He tried the key Victor handed him. It turned, but with considerable resistance, the metal grinding against metal in a way that suggested misalignment or internal damage. "How often do you use this door?" Walter asked, pulling out his basic toolkit. "Not very often," Victor admitted, standing close enough that Walter could smell his cologne, something woody and expensive, probably European. "Perhaps once or twice a week. I prefer the front entrance. But I worry that if I need to leave quickly through the back, the lock will fail completely." "That's a reasonable concern," Walter agreed, working the key back and forth to get a feel for where the resistance was occurring. "Let me take a look at the mechanism itself." "When did you first notice the problem?" Walter asked, pulling out his tools. "Perhaps 2 weeks ago," Victor said, standing close enough that Walter could smell his cologne, something woody and expensive. "It has gotten worse each day." Walter worked methodically, first removing the deadbolt assembly from the door. As he examined the internal mechanism, he found the source of the problem immediately. The cylinder had been installed incorrectly, creating friction against the housing. It was amateur work, the kind of installation that would fail within months. Walter worked methodically, first removing the deadbolt assembly from the door. He had done this thousands of times, the movements automatic after so many years. Remove the screws from the interior plate, carefully extract the cylinder, examine the pins and springs for wear or damage. As he examined the internal mechanism, he found the source of the problem immediately. The cylinder had been installed incorrectly, creating friction against the housing. Someone had forced it in at a slight angle, perhaps a fraction of a degree off, but enough to cause binding. It was amateur work, the kind of installation that would fail within months. Walter had seen this before, usually when people tried to save money by installing their own locks without proper training. What bothered him was that everything else about this townhouse suggested attention to detail, from the precisely arranged books to the carefully maintained exterior. Why would someone so meticulous allow such sloppy work on something as important as a lock? "Looks like whoever put this in didn't align it properly," Walter explained, setting the damaged cylinder on his work cloth. The tolerance was off by at least 2 degrees, maybe 3. "It's been grinding against the housing every time you turn the key. See here." He pointed to the wear marks on the metal. "This brass is softer than the steel housing, so it's been shaving away microscopic amounts with each use. Eventually it would have seized completely, or the key would have broken off inside." Victor leaned in to look, his expression showing what appeared to be genuine interest. "You can tell all that just from looking." 30 years of experience," Walter said with a modest shrug. "You learn to read the metal, see the patterns of wear. Every lock tells a story if you know how to listen. This one's been telling me it was installed wrong since the moment I touched it." Walter paused, studying Victor's face. "Can I ask who installed this for you?" Victor's expression shifted, just slightly. a momentary tightness around his eyes. "A handyman," he said. "Someone recommended by a neighbor. He said he knew what he was doing, but clearly that was not true." "I can fix it, but I'd recommend replacing the whole unit," Walter continued. "This one's already showing wear damage that goes beyond just the misalignment. The pins are wearing unevenly, and the springs have lost some of their tension. A new lock would be safer and more reliable." "Whatever you think is best," Victor agreed quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I trust your judgment. Cost is not a concern. I simply want it to work properly." As Walter worked, Victor excused himself, saying he needed to make a phone call for his work. Walter heard him speaking in what sounded like Russian from somewhere deeper in the house, the consonants harsh and unfamiliar. He thought nothing of it. Washington was full of foreign nationals, diplomats, embassy workers, international students from Georgetown University and George Washington University. Hearing foreign languages was as common as hearing English. Walter himself had picked up bits of Spanish and French from working with embassy staff over the years, though he was far from fluent. Walter removed the damaged deadbolt and set it aside, arranging the pieces on his work cloth in the order they had come out, a habit that made reassembly easier. Then he began preparing to install a new one. He had brought several options in his bag, ranging from basic models to higher security versions, with hardened steel bolts and pick-resistant cylinders. Given Victor's apparent concern about security, Walter thought he might recommend one of the better models. As he sorted through his inventory, examining which lock would be most appropriate for this application, he noticed something odd about the doorframe itself. The doorframe showed signs of recent modification. There were fresh drill holes that didn't align with the current lock position, as if someone had tried to install something else first, gotten the measurements wrong, then changed their mind and started over. The wood around these holes had been filled with putty and painted over, but the paint didn't quite match the rest of the frame. It was close, maybe close enough that most people wouldn't notice, but Walter's eye was trained to spot these kinds of discrepancies. He ran his finger over the frame, feeling the texture. The filled holes were slightly proud of the surrounding wood, creating tiny bumps that his fingertips could detect even though his eyes could barely see them. Someone had done the repair work competently, but not perfectly. That bothered him because it didn't fit with the rest of what he had observed. Everything else about this place suggested either meticulous attention to detail or deliberate carelessness. This repair work fell somewhere in between, as if done by someone skilled but rushing. Then he noticed something else. Behind where the deadbolt sat, there was a slight gap in the doorframe, barely visible even when he looked directly at it. It was maybe 1/8 of an inch at most, but it shouldn't have been there. Doorframes in houses this well-maintained didn't develop gaps. Wood might settle over time, but this house wasn't old enough for that kind of structural movement. Walter pulled out his small penlight flashlight, the kind he kept on his keychain for checking lock mechanisms in dim spaces. He shined it into the gap, angling the beam to penetrate as deeply as possible. What he saw made him pause, made his breath catch in his throat for just a moment. There was another lock mechanism hidden inside the wall cavity, completely separate from the visible deadbolt. It was unlike anything Walter had seen in residential construction during his entire career. The device appeared to be some kind of secondary locking system, far more sophisticated than the simple deadbolt on the door's surface. It had multiple pins, what looked like a tumbler system with at least 6 chambers, possibly 7 or even 8. Standard residential locks used 5-pin systems at most. This was something else entirely. The mechanism was connected to a metal rod that ran vertically inside the wall, presumably to a secondary bolt at the top or bottom of the door, or perhaps to something else. Walter couldn't see the full extent of the system, but what he could see was impressive in its complexity. The metalwork was precision machined, the kind of quality you saw in high-security commercial applications or government installations. The chamber pins appeared to be made of hardened steel, possibly with anti-pick features like serrated or mushroom pins that would defeat standard lock-picking techniques. But more than the technical sophistication, what struck Walter was the concealment. This lock was designed to be completely invisible unless you knew exactly where to look and had the right angle and lighting to see it. It wasn't just hidden behind the doorframe. It was integrated into the wall structure in a way that would require significant demolition to discover. Whoever had installed this had done so with the clear intention that it should never be found. Walter sat back on his heels, his mind racing through possibilities. This was odd, certainly, but perhaps it was simply additional security. Some people were paranoid about break-ins, especially in urban areas. Washington had its share of property crime. Maybe Victor had been burglarized before and wanted extra protection that a thief wouldn't expect. That would explain the concealment. But even as Walter tried to rationalize what he had seen, his professional instincts told him something else was at play. He had installed high-security systems before. He had worked with clients who wanted protection against everything from simple break-ins to sophisticated attacks. But those installations were never hidden like this. The whole point of good security was that it deterred criminals. Visible security measures made a target less attractive. You wanted burglars to see your deadbolts, your reinforced doors, your alarm systems. You wanted them to choose an easier target. Hidden security only made sense if you wanted to protect something while avoiding attention. If you wanted people to think your security was ordinary when it was actually extraordinary. If you needed to conceal the fact that you were concealing something. Walter thought about the sparse furnishings, the carefully chosen books, the staged quality of the living room. He thought about Victor's accent, his nervousness, the way he had been so quick to dismiss the handyman who had installed the lock so poorly. He thought about the Russian phone call. Individually, these things meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern, and Walter had been working in Washington long enough to know what that pattern might mean. Still, something about it nagged at him. The hidden lock was far more complex than necessary for a simple townhouse. And why hide it at all? If you wanted better security, you installed better locks on the surface. You added chains and bars and alarm systems. You didn't hide sophisticated locking mechanisms inside walls, where they would never deter anyone, because no one would know they existed, unless the point wasn't to deter, unless the point was to conceal, to protect something valuable enough that it needed protection no one could find. He was still contemplating this when Victor returned. "Is there a problem?" Victor asked, his tone pleasant, but with an edge of tension Walter hadn't noticed before. No problem," Walter said carefully. "Just taking my time to do it right. I noticed you've got some unusual reinforcement in this doorframe. Extra security." Victor's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Washington can be dangerous. I prefer to be careful." "Sure, of course," Walter agreed, turning back to his work. But now his mind was racing. The hidden lock, the sparse living space, the way Victor had positioned himself to watch every move Walter made. Individually, these things meant nothing. Together they formed a pattern that made Walter uneasy. He installed the new deadbolt efficiently, testing it several times to ensure smooth operation. As he packed up his tools, he made a decision. When he wrote up the service ticket, he would make a note about the unusual secondary lock. Not a formal report, just a note in his own records, just in case. "That will be $35, Walter said, handing Victor the key. Victor paid in cash, exact change, as if he had known the price in advance. He thanked Walter and ushered him to the front door with barely concealed eagerness. As Walter stepped out onto the street, he glanced back at the townhouse. For just a moment he saw the curtain in the second-floor window twitch, as if someone had been watching. Walter drove back to his shop on Pennsylvania Avenue, the observation gnawing at him. He had worked in Washington long enough to develop instincts about these things. Something was off about that house, about Victor Petrov, about the whole situation. But what could he do? Call the police and tell them what? That a man had an unusual lock in his door? That he seemed nervous? These weren't crimes. He decided to mention it to an old friend, Frank Morrison, who worked as a security contractor for various government agencies. Frank would know if this was worth pursuing, or if Walter was just being paranoid. They met for lunch the next day at a diner near Walter's shop. Frank was a barrel-chested man in his late 50s, with a military bearing he had never quite shed after his years in the army. They met for lunch the next day at a diner near Walter's shop, a place called Maggie's that served simple food and minded its own business. Frank was a barrel-chested man in his late 50s with a military bearing he had never quite shed after his years in the army. He had served in Korea and then worked in military intelligence for a decade before transitioning to civilian security work. He consulted for various agencies now, doing threat assessments and security audits, the kind of work that kept him connected to the intelligence community without requiring him to navigate its internal politics. Frank ordered the meatloaf, as he always did. Walter had coffee and apple pie, his usual lunch when he was too busy to eat properly. They made small talk for a few minutes, discussing sports and weather and Frank's ongoing renovation of his basement. Then Walter got to the point. "So what's got you all worked up?" Frank asked, cutting into his meatloaf with the side of his fork. "You sounded pretty concerned on the phone." Walter described the service corps, choosing his words carefully even though they were in a public place. He talked about the hidden lock mechanism, Victor's behavior, the feeling that something wasn't quite right. As he talked, he watched Frank's expression shift from casual interest to focused attention. Frank set down his fork and leaned forward slightly. "You said 34th Street. Frank asked quietly. "What was the house number?" Walter told him. Frank was quiet for a moment, chewing thoughtfully, his jaw working slowly as he processed the information. Then he leaned back in the booth and looked at Walter with an expression that was carefully neutral. "Walter, I need you to do something for me. Don't go back to that house. If this Petrov calls you again, tell him you're booked up. Give him another locksmith's number, whatever. But don't go back there yourself. Don't go near that property again." "Why?" Walter asked, feeling a cold weight settle in his stomach. "What do you know?" "I don't know anything for certain," Frank said carefully, his voice low. "But I know enough to know that you should stay away. The neighborhood you described, the profile of the individual, certain patterns we watch for. Walter, you might have stumbled into something. Can you draw me a diagram of that lock you saw? The hidden one. I need to see exactly what you're talking about." Walter sketched it out on a napkin, trying to recall every detail. Frank studied the drawing intently. "This is important, Walter. I'm going to pass this along to some people I know. They're going to want to talk to you, probably. Will you cooperate if they reach out?" "Of course," Walter said. "Frank, what's going on?" "I can't tell you much," Frank admitted, "but there are certain patterns we watch for. Unusual security measures in residential properties, foreign nationals behaving in certain ways. It might be nothing, but it might be something." 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon when the shop was quiet, 2 men in dark suits appeared at Walter's shop. They showed him FBI credentials bearing their photographs and the official seal. The older agent's identification listed him as Special Agent Gerald Patterson. The younger one showed credentials for Special Agent Michael Davis. They asked if they could speak with him privately. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed, then led them to his small office in the back, past shelves of keys and lock mechanisms. The office was cramped, barely large enough for Walter's desk, a filing cabinet, and 2 extra chairs that now held the FBI agents. The walls were covered with manufacturer catalogs and a few photographs of Walter's family. His toolbox sat on the floor beside his desk, the same one that had been with him on the call to Victor Petrov's house. The older of the 2 agents, a man named Gerald Patterson, did most of the talking. He was in his mid-40s with prematurely grey hair and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much deception, too many betrayals, too many people who looked ordinary while harboring extraordinary secrets. His suit was government issue, his tie perfectly knotted, his demeanor professional but not cold. Davis, the younger agent, had a notebook and pen ready, but said nothing, his eyes constantly scanning the office as if cataloguing every detail. "Mr. Jennings," Patterson began, his voice measured and calm, "we understand you performed a service call at a residence on 34th Street this past Tuesday. Can you tell us everything you remember about that visit? And I mean everything, even details that seem insignificant or unrelated. Sometimes the smallest observation matters more than people realize." Walter recounted the story again, in even more detail this time. He described the cherry blossoms, the sparse furniture, the books on the shelf, Victor's cologne, the sound of Russian from the back room. He talked about the doorframe modifications, the hidden lock mechanism, the precision machining of the components. As he spoke, Patterson took notes in a small leather-bound notebook, while Davis listened without expression. occasionally nodding slightly as if confirming something he already suspected. "This lock mechanism you saw?" Patterson said when Walter finished. "You're certain it was inside the wall cavity, not just a reinforced deadbolt or some kind of surface-mounted security feature?" "I'm certain," Walter confirmed, pulling out the napkin sketch he had made for Frank. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I know the difference between standard residential security and something else. This was engineered, purpose-built. It had at least 6 pin chambers, maybe more, and the metalwork was precision-machined. Government quality may be better, the kind of thing you see in high-security facilities, not townhouses. And it was completely concealed. You would never find it unless you knew exactly where to look, had the right angle and lighting. I only saw it because I happened to shine my flashlight at the exact right spot while looking for why the surface lock was binding." Patterson and Davis exchanged a glance, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Mr. Jennings, what I'm about to tell you is classified information," Patterson said, leaning forward slightly. His tone shifted, becoming more serious, more personal. "You cannot share this with anyone, not your wife, not your children, not even your friend Frank Morrison, who we know you spoke with. This conversation never happened. The information I'm about to share exists only in this room. Do you understand the seriousness of what I'm saying?" "I understand," Walter agreed, his pulse quickening, his mouth suddenly dry. Patterson nodded, seeming to evaluate Walter's sincerity. Then he continued. "The man you know as Viktor Petrov is a person of interest in an ongoing counterintelligence investigation. We believe he may be operating as what we call an illegal, a Soviet intelligence officer, living under false identity in the United States. Not a diplomat with cover, not someone attached to their embassy or consulates, but a deep cover agent who has assumed a completely fabricated American identity." Walter felt the blood drain from his face, felt the office walls seem to close in slightly. A Soviet spy. He had been working in a Soviet spy's house, alone, vulnerable, handling tools that could have been used as weapons against him if things had gone wrong. Patterson continued, his voice steady and matter-of-fact, as if discussing something far less dramatic. "These illegals, as we call them, are among the most dangerous operatives the Soviets deploy. They spend years, sometimes decades, building their cover identities. They learn to speak English without accents, or with regional American accents. They study American culture, history, sports. They create entire fictional life stories, complete with forged documents, manufactured employment histories, fabricated family connections. They become, to all outward appearances, ordinary American citizens. Then they gather intelligence, recruit assets, coordinate other agents, and transmit classified information back to Moscow." Patterson paused, letting that sink in. "The lock mechanism you discovered may be part of a concealment system for sensitive materials. Documents, microfilm, radio equipment, instructions from their handlers. These illegals often have sophisticated hiding places built into their residences. We've seen false walls, hidden floor compartments, modified furniture. But this lock system you described, if it's what we think it is, represents a level of engineering sophistication we haven't encountered before in a residential setting. It suggests support from Moscow's technical services, which means Petrov, or whatever his real name is important to their operations here." Walter felt the blood drain from his face. A Soviet spy. He had been working in a Soviet spy's house, alone, vulnerable. "Am I in danger?" he asked. "We don't believe so," Davis spoke for the first time. "If Petrov suspected you had discovered anything significant, you would have known immediately. The fact that he let you leave suggests he thinks you saw nothing unusual." "What happens now?" Walter asked. "Now you forget this conversation ever happened," Patterson said firmly. "You go back to your regular life. If Petrov contacts you again, you follow the advice Frank Morrison gave you. You're too busy, you recommend someone else. Under no circumstances do you go back to that house. But don't you want to arrest him?" Walter pressed. "If he's a spy." "It's not that simple," Patterson said. "Petrov is part of a larger network. If we move on him now, we tip off the others. We need to watch, to wait, to understand the full scope of their operation. Your discovery of that hidden lock has given us valuable information about their operational security measures. It confirms several theories we've been working on, but we need time to develop this further." Walter left the meeting feeling like he had stepped into a different world, one that existed in parallel to his normal life, of keys and locks and satisfied customers. For weeks afterward, he found himself looking over his shoulder, wondering if he was being watched, if Viktor Petrov somehow knew he had talked to the FBI. But life continued. Spring turned to summer. Walter worked his regular jobs, fixed locks, cut keys, helped people who had locked themselves out of their cars or homes. The incident on 34th Street began to feel almost dreamlike, something that had happened to someone else. Then, on a humid evening in late August, Frank Morrison called him. "Turn on the news," Frank said, without preamble. "Channel 7. Walter switched on the small television he kept in his shop. The evening news was showing footage of FBI agents leading a man in handcuffs out of a townhouse. Walter recognized the address immediately, 34th Street, and he recognized the man in handcuffs, Viktor Petrov. The news anchor's voice cut through Walter's shock. In a major counterintelligence operation, the FBI today arrested 6 individuals suspected of being part of a Soviet spy ring operating in Washington, District of Columbia. The suspects, all of whom entered the country using false identities, are believed to have been gathering classified information about United States military capabilities and passing it to the Soviet Union. Among those arrested was Viktor Petrov, whose real name is believed to be Yuri Mikhailovich Sokolov, a trained intelligence officer with the Soviet KGB. The camera panned across the front of the townhouse, and Walter saw something that made his breath catch. The back door, his back door, the one with the problematic deadbolt, had been removed entirely. FBI technicians were carefully extracting something from the wall cavity. Even from the television footage, Walter could see it was the hidden lock mechanism he had discovered. The news report continued. According to FBI sources, the spy ring used sophisticated concealment methods to hide classified documents and communications equipment. One such system, discovered during the arrests, involved a hidden compartment accessible through a complex lock mechanism built into the structure of the residence itself. Walter sat down heavily in his desk chair. His accidental discovery, his simple observation about an unusual lock, had been the thread that unraveled an entire Soviet intelligence operation. The next day, Agent Patterson came to see him again. "I wanted to thank you personally," Patterson said. "That lock you found, it led us to similar systems in 3 other residences. We've been able to roll up an entire network because of what you discovered. These people had been operating for almost 7 years. They had access to classified information from the Pentagon, the State Department, even some NATO materials that were being shared through diplomatic channels. The damage they could have done, the damage they did do, it's incalculable." "I was just doing my job," Walter said, still processing everything. "That's exactly right," Patterson agreed. "You were doing your job with competence and attention to detail. That's what made the difference. These spies, they plan for surveillance, for counterintelligence operations, for sophisticated technical detection, but they don't plan for an honest locksmith who notices things are not quite right." Over the following weeks and months, more details emerged. The spy ring had been operating since 1965. They had successfully transmitted information about American missile technology, submarine capabilities, and strategic defense planning. The hidden lock systems Walter had discovered were access points to compartments where microfilm, encrypted radio equipment, and instructions from Moscow were stored. Each lock required a specific key that could be quickly destroyed if necessary. The complexity of the mechanism meant it couldn't be easily picked or forced, buying the spies time to destroy evidence if their cover was blown. The intelligence value of what they had stolen was estimated to have advanced Soviet military capabilities by several years. Lives had potentially been lost because of the information they provided. If the spy ring had continued operating, the damage would have been catastrophic. Viktor Petrov, whose real name was indeed Yuri Sokolov, had been a KGB officer for 15 years before being deployed to the United States as an illegal. He had built the entire false identity, complete with fabricated employment records, social connections, and a carefully constructed cover story. He spoke English fluently, understood American culture, and had successfully blended into Washington society. His tradecraft was excellent. His operational security was nearly perfect, nearly but not quite, because he had made one small mistake. When the original installer had failed to properly align his hidden lock with the door frame, causing the visible deadbolt to malfunction, Sokolov had been forced to call a locksmith. He had calculated the risk and deemed it acceptable. The hidden lock was designed to be invisible to casual observation. A locksmith would fix the surface deadbolt and leave, none the wiser. He hadn't counted on Walter Jennings, whose 3 decades of experience meant he noticed things others would miss. Who saw the fresh drill holes, the subtle gap in the doorframe, the inconsistent paintwork? Who had the curiosity to shine a flashlight into that gap and the knowledge to understand what he was seeing? Sokolov and the other members of his network were convicted of espionage. Most received lengthy prison sentences. 2 were eventually exchanged in prisoner swaps, returning to the Soviet Union to unknown fates. The case was kept relatively quiet, reported in newspapers, but without the sensationalism that might have accompanied it. The government preferred it that way. The less the Soviets knew about how their network had been compromised, the better. For Walter, life slowly returned to normal. He continued working as a locksmith, though now he occasionally received calls from government agencies asking him to inspect their security systems. His experience had given him a unique perspective on operational security. He could spot concealment systems that others might miss. He never spoke publicly about his role in uncovering the spy ring. Agent Patterson had made clear that certain details needed to remain classified. But sometimes, when he was working on a particularly complex lock, Walter would remember that morning in March, the hidden mechanism in the wall, the moment when he realized something was not quite right. The case became something of a legend within the FBI and CIA, though most of the details remained secret for decades. It was cited in training materials as an example of how intelligence operations could be compromised by seemingly insignificant details, how the most carefully planned espionage activities could be undone by the very security measures designed to protect them. The hidden locks themselves became objects of study. The FBI's Technical Services Division analyzed them extensively, learning new information about Soviet concealment techniques and engineering capabilities. The design was elegant in its simplicity, using principles of mechanical engineering that required no electronic components that might be detected by surveillance equipment. Each lock was handcrafted, suggesting a high level of training and support from Moscow. The case also revealed how deeply Soviet intelligence had penetrated American society. The illegals in Sokolov's network had lived among ordinary Americans for years, developing friendships, joining community organizations, becoming part of the social fabric of Washington. Their neighbors had no idea they were foreign agents. Their co-workers trusted them. They had successfully deceived everyone around them. Everyone except a locksmith who paid attention to the details of his craft. Years later, after the Cold War had ended and the Soviet Union had collapsed, some files from the KGB were made available to Western researchers. Among them was a case study of the Sokolov network's capture. The KGB analysis concluded that the hidden lock system, while mechanically sound, had been a tactical error. The report noted that reliance on physical security measures always created points of vulnerability. Any system that required external maintenance or repair created opportunities for discovery. The report specifically mentioned Walter Jennings, though not by name. It referred to him as a skilled tradesman whose expertise and observation led to the network's compromise. The KGB analysts recommended that future operations avoid any security systems that might require professional servicing from local contractors. Better to rely on systems that operatives could maintain themselves, even if they were less sophisticated. It was a lesson learned too late to save Sokolov and his colleagues. Walter worked as a locksmith until he was 72 years old, finally retiring in 1991, the same year the Soviet Union formally dissolved. He spent his retirement gardening and spending time with his grandchildren, who never knew about the crucial role he had played in Cold War counterintelligence. He had signed too many non-disclosure agreements to ever tell them the full story, but sometimes, when his grandson would ask him about his career, Walter would say that being a locksmith taught him the importance of attention to detail. That small things mattered, that a fraction of a millimeter in how a key is cut or how a pin aligns in a cylinder could be the difference between a lock that works and one that doesn't, between security and vulnerability, between secrets kept and secrets revealed. He would say that locks were really just puzzles, and solving them required patience, knowledge, and a willingness to look closely at what others might overlook. These lessons, he told his grandson, applied to more than just metalwork and keys. They applied to life itself. What Walter couldn't tell his grandson was that these same principles had helped unravel one of the most successful Soviet espionage operations ever conducted on American soil, that his careful attention to a malfunctioning deadbolt had exposed a spy ring that threatened national security, that his ordinary skills, applied with extraordinary diligence, had made him an unlikely hero in a secret war most Americans never knew was being fought. The townhouse on 34th Street was eventually sold to a new family. The back door was replaced entirely, and all evidence of the hidden compartment system was removed. The house looked like any other in the neighborhood, ordinary and unremarkable. Only a small number of people knew what had once been concealed within its walls. The FBI kept Walter's involvement classified for over 30 years. It wasn't until 2005 that the details of the case were partially declassified and included in a broader report about Soviet intelligence operations during the Cold War. Even then, Walter's name was redacted from public versions of the documents. The government's reasoning was simple. There might still be undiscovered Soviet agents in the United States, and revealing the methods by which previous networks had been caught could compromise ongoing operations. Walter passed away in 2008 at the age of 89. His obituary in the Washington Post made no mention of his role in counterintelligence. It simply stated that he had been a skilled locksmith who served the Washington community for over 40 years, that he was survived by his wife, 3 children, and 7 grandchildren, that he had been a member of his local church and enjoyed woodworking in his spare time. But in a secured room at FBI headquarters, there was a file bearing Walter's name. In it were detailed accounts of his discovery, photographs of the hidden lock mechanism, diagrams he had drawn on napkins and official forms. There were commendations from senior officials, thanking him for his service to his country. There was a letter signed by the director of the FBI in 1972 acknowledging that Walter's keen observation and cooperation had been instrumental in disrupting a significant threat to national security. Agent Gerald Patterson, who had first interviewed Walter about his discovery, attended the funeral. He stood at the back of the church during the service, listening as Walter's children talked about their father's dedication to his craft, his honesty, his quiet competence. Patterson thought about how perfectly these qualities described not just a good locksmith, but an unlikely spy catcher. After the service, Patterson approached Walter's eldest son. "Your father once did something important for this country," Patterson said quietly. "I can't tell you the details, and those details may never be fully declassified. But I wanted you to know that he made a difference, a real difference. We were grateful for his service." Walter's son looked puzzled but nodded. "My father never talked much about his work. He was a humble man. But thank you for telling me that." Patterson left the funeral thinking about the invisible war that had been fought during the Cold War and the many ordinary citizens who had played crucial roles without recognition or glory. People like Walter Jennings, who simply did their jobs well and paid attention to what was in front of them. The story of how a locksmith accidentally uncovered a Soviet secret never became a headline. It never inspired a movie or a best-selling book. Most people who walked past that townhouse on 34th Street never knew what had happened there. They never knew about the hidden compartments, the microfilm, the coded messages from Moscow. They never knew about Viktor Petrov, who was really Yuri Sokolov, or the network of spies he had coordinated. And they never knew about Walter Jennings, who fixed a stubborn deadbolt and, in doing so, helped protect his country from those who sought to steal its secrets. His contribution to national security would remain classified long after his death, known only to a handful of people who understood its significance. But in the world of intelligence and counterintelligence, where successes are rarely celebrated publicly and heroes remain anonymous, Walter's story became a reminder of an important truth, that the great struggles of history are not only decided by diplomats and generals, by grand strategies and complex operations. Sometimes they are decided by ordinary people doing ordinary work with uncommon skill and attention, by locksmiths who notice when something isn't quite right, by citizens who, when confronted with suspicious circumstances, choose to speak up rather than look away. The Cold War was filled with dramatic moments, with crises that brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation, with bold espionage operations and daring defections. But it was also won through countless small victories, through the accumulated efforts of people like Walter Jennings, who probably never thought of himself as a participant in that great struggle. He was just a locksmith, fixing locks, solving puzzles, paying attention to the details. And on one ordinary spring morning in 1972, those details changed everything. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.